Although the latest from Westminster.
A diplomatic row between Britain and Greece, how to reform the NHS, and is the UK still a leader on climate change? This is Politics Live. Joining me, Conservative MP Luke Evans, Shadow Health Minister Preet Gill, Kate Andrews from The Spectator and Ava Santina Evans from Politics Joe. Today.
If I told you that you would cut the Mona Lisa in half, and you would have half of it at the Louvre and half of it at the British Museum, do you think your viewers would appreciate the beauty of the painting?
The Greek Prime Minister wants these sculptures back, but Rishi Sunak has cancelled a meeting with him this lunchtime.
I know some people don't like the word reform, but I tell you now, we must be the government that finally transforms our NHS.
Politicians say the NHS needs reform, but we'll speak to a doctor who says GPs are already dangerously overworked.
I'm not going to be put off by people calling it Project Fear. I am fearful about jobs.
You put a bomb under our economy. And the worst thing is, we would have lit the fuse ourselves.
That was 7 years ago, but were people too gloomy about Brexit? World leaders are heading to Dubai this week to talk about climate change. But what will the summit achieve? Well, let's start with the diplomatic fallout from this story broken by the BBC's political editor, Chris Mason, yesterday. Sunak cancels Greek Prime Minister meeting in Parthenon sculptures row. Yes, it follows comments you heard there in the headlines from Kyriakos Mitsotakis that the sculptures, known as the Elgen Marbles, should be returned to Athens, where they belong. Let's talk to the BBC's chief political correspondent, Henry Zeffman. This is quite some diplomatic row, Henry, and quite some snub from Rishi Sunak. Why is he making such a public row over this?
Well, the story either begins 2,500 years ago or on Sunday. So I think for the sake of clarity, let's start with Sunday, because I think that's quite crucial to understanding what happened here. On Sunday with Laura Kuenssberg, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, at the start of a several-day visit to the UK, which was meant to culminate in a meeting with Rishi Sunak at Downing Street, he was asked about this long-running dispute over where the Elgin Marbles, held at the British Museum, should go, whether they should be returned to the Acropolis in Athens. And he said, he used this very colourful phrase to talk about how the current situation was as if you cut the Mona Lisa in two and had half of it in Paris and half of it at the British Museum. Now, obviously, that has been his position, the Greek government's position, for a very long time. But people in Downing Street thought that they had had assurances from the Greek government that Mr. Mitsotakis would not make this a big public cause while he was in the UK. And instead, he did, and they therefore, we're told, called this meeting off. However, people in the Greek government say there were no such assurances. They find it bemusing that Downing Street wouldn't have expected him to give that answer to those inevitable questions, and they profess just to being a bit bewildered by all of this.
Right, and he's headed home, the Greek Prime Minister. He rejected the idea of meeting the Deputy Prime Minister, Oliver Dowden, and will just leave that hanging. I mean, one might suspect raw politics at work here, Henry, and a useful dividing line with Labour.
There's definitely a bit of politics here. There is a long simmering question, which I think is bubbling further towards the surface in society as much as in politics, about the place of museums and their collections from all around the world in the modern age, in an age where lots of countries have independence in a way that they perhaps didn't when the collections were assembled. And Rishi Sunak is very firmly saying that he believes that the permanent place of the Elgin Marbles, the Parthenon sculptures, should be in the British Museum. I think there is a slight difference of opinion with the Labour Party there, who, and by the way, it's worth noting, Keir Starmer did meet the Greek Prime Minister yesterday. The Labour Party says they don't think it is a question for the government at all. If Keir Starmer were Prime Minister and the British Museum and the Greek government reached a deal, a Labour government would not stand in their way. I mean, just simply as a question of law, it is the case that if the British Museum were to come to an agreement to loan the marbles for some period of time, perhaps a very long period of time, back to Greece, then there isn't really anything the government could do.
Henry Zethman, thank you very much. Starting with you, Luke, was Rishi Sunak right to snub the Greek Prime Minister?
I think in this case he was, and the reason I would say that is because if you have assurances before going into a meeting, this wouldn't be discussed and it's changed.
Although they've denied that.
I think, well, absolutely. I've asked Number 10 and they said that was the case, so you'll have to ask someone above my pay grade to do it. Was it right when this subject has been simmering for such a long time to actually ask the Prime Minister of Greece to be silent? Well, Jo, I think you're right. We could turn it round and say, well, is it interesting that the Prime Minister of Greece, with so much to discuss, declined a meeting with the Deputy Prime Minister? So he was offered that meeting to have that discussion and decided not to. I mean, here we are having 200 years on having that fight. The government's position has been clear. Successive governments have said it's a matter for the trustees of the British Museum to decide. He broke a deal. Was it right to snub?
I think it's really pathetic. I mean, Rishi would have known that, of course, this is going to come up and it's going to be a discussion. Greece is an important NATO ally. There are lots of things to talk to him about, for example, the economy, Ukraine, the Middle East. Keir Starmer met with the Greece Prime Minister yesterday. Those are the issues that he talked about. So, to be honest, I mean, this just shows Rishi being very weak yet again. Clear failure, and, you know, to snub him in this way, I just think is so embarrassing for our country. Luke? Well, I was just saying, there was an offer there to the Deputy Prime Minister. Are we saying the same thing to the Greek Prime Minister, that he was being pathetic as well for deciding to... It's not the Deputy Prime Minister that wanted to meet him. It's the Prime Minister of Greece, a NATO ally. You could ask the question, why did the Greek Prime Minister decide to change that meeting? We don't know why they do. They have lots of different reasons. No, but it's... Lots of leaders are going to talk about these issues,
but what's controversial? The Prime Minister doesn't give running commentary on his diary.
Talking about the Elgin Marbles?
Well, no, absolutely. So, the government's made its position clear for the last 200 years. I mean, Neil Kinnock did have a different position. I don't know if Keir Starmer's going to follow Neil Kinnock's position of giving them back, or Tony Blair's decision to hold on to them. Well, it's a matter for the chair, George Osborne, to make a decision so the trustees about actually what the British Museum is going to do. We don't have that level of detail. They can already make a loan. You don't have to change the Heritage Act in order to do that. But, of course, we don't have it. But this is really weak from a Prime Minister. A G7 nation, this is not the way you behave. Keir Starmer showed the clear leadership that this country is wanting. What do you make of all this?
It's a convenient political story for everybody involved, because for Greece, the sculptures are back in the news. For the Prime Minister, fallout from the autumn statement and talk of net migration figures is not at the top of the BBC this morning. Oh. So it is, I think, truly convenient for everybody involved to be talking about this issue, because, you know, dare say we talk about the 7.8 million people on the NHS waiting list, or, you know, any other major piece of public policy we might need to discuss.
What do you make of the diplomacy? We're going to just show pictures, Ava, of the Elgin Marbles, or the Parthenon sculptures, as they are called. Here they are in the British Museum. In the 19th century, the British ambassador, Lord Elgin, was granted permission by the Ottoman Empire, the governing authority in Athens, to receive and remove some of the sculptures, and his collection was transported to the UK. And as you heard from Henry Zethman, after a parliamentary select committee in 1816 deemed his actions legal, they were transferred to the museum by an Act of Parliament.
Yes, but that's not unequivocal. I mean, many figures have debated that, you know, how serious that select committee was on that decision. I mean, you've got Lord Byron and you've got many MPs at the time. You've now got Stephen Fry, who questions the validity of that decision. Look, I think, you know, the British public are quite clear with what they think about the marbles. They think that they should go back. It's also a real culture war issue that I don't think people really care about. And, you know, back to your point on immigration, that is something the public do really care about. And you'd think that perhaps the Prime Minister might want to meet with the Greek Prime Minister, considering you've got so many refugees passing through Greece at the moment on their way to the UK. Right, I mean, lost that opportunity. I mean, there are other more controversial leaders whom Rishi Sunak has met since he's been Prime Minister, for instance, from Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, but not the Prime Minister of Greece. Why not?
Well, I think he's made his position clear that he felt that there was an agreement that was agreed, and if, I guess, We
Do you
could
think
be sat
looks
on the
grown up?
Well, we could be sat on the flip side, though, having this debate. If a full-on diplomatic spat had happened the other way, I'd be sat here trying to say, well, hang on, should this meeting have gone ahead in the first place? So they've made a decision, the Prime Minister's made a decision, put an offer out. I think the same questions apply to the Greek Prime Minister, why he chose not to have that if there's such important decisions.
And do you think
we've spent 20 minutes now talking about this, when I totally agree with the other side of the table that we should be debating about some of the things in the country.
Is leadership about the ability to say, this is my position and I stand by it?
Why
are you so weak as the Prime Minister to cancel a meeting because you don't want to talk about a tough, difficult decision? I already told you what Keir's decision is. If there is a loan, you know, that the British Museum agrees with Greece, then of course we won't block it. But I mean, this is a matter for the British Museum to make a decision about the cultural relationships it has with other countries. And of course, you know, if
but the Greeks haven't asked for a loan, they've asked for them back.
No,
so
but
that would need a change of law.
this is about negotiation. So this is why you have meetings.
Well, we can see Keir Starmer and his team there, Yvette Cooper and David Lammy, sitting with the Prime Minister of Greece and his team talking. Whether they talked at length about the Parthenon sculptures is another matter. But yes, we are told that Keir Starmer would certainly consider the idea of them being handed back on long-term loan, but it was something for the British Museum and Greece to discuss. Why not give them back? Why shouldn't Labour's line be give them back permanently?
Look, let's just be clear about the priorities of the country. We've got an economic crisis, an energy crisis. Sure. These are really important issues that Labour is not going to spend lots of time. That's why I think it's
you did have time to meet. You did have time to meet on that issue. Why not give them back? If you were prepared to give them a loan of these sculptures, why not say have them back altogether?
Talking about illegal migration, talking about the economy, talking about COP, that's exactly what Keir's talking about, the priorities of the British public. And he is obviously able to talk about what his view is on this issue. He's not shying away from cancelling meetings. The Prime Minister of this country should be meeting a NATO ally. And the very fact that he cowered and was so weak because he didn't want to discuss this topic or relay actually what he believes, he can't stand by what he believes, that makes him very weak.
But philosophically, where do you stand? Where does Labour stand? Do those sculptures belong in Athens or do they belong in the British Museum?
Look, I believe that institutions like the British Museum should have the opportunity to build cultural relationships with other countries around loaning this. Now, that's a bigger conversation to have. I think the priorities of the British public are not this, and that is exactly what Keir's focused on.
What do you think, Ava? Because there are people who think if we did give the sculptures back permanently, it could lead to all sorts of other artefacts from museums heading back to where they originally came from.
And it would. I mean, you know, obviously, I think that the marbles should go back. You've ripped apart a tableau. I mean, you know, it's a set of friezes. It's meant to be seen as a piece of art in its entirety. It doesn't quite make sense when it's all jumbled and not matched together. But, you know, on the point of restitution, yes, if we were to give these back, it would raise questions for other pieces in our museum. So perhaps those are questions that we should be looking at.
Kate?
I think there is a strong moral case and a case in terms of those who want to visit the sculptures, that they should be pieced together. And I think Greece has done a great job with the Acropolis Museum to set a very high bar for what it would mean to send these pieces of artwork back and make sure they're well taken care of. I have to believe that compromise can be reached here, that some form of recognized joint ownership, perhaps some form of long-term loan, could make this a wonderful viewing pleasure for those who come to visit the sculptures. But I think that point about a high bar of what it would take to send them back is the really important one, so you don't go down that slippery slope of starting to hand back loads and loads of other stuff.
Let's talk about the NHS and the NHS workload particularly, and have a look at this headline when it comes up in The Times, which says GPs call for waiting lists and a safe limit of 25 patients a day. A suggestion made at a national conference of GP leaders last week. Delegates said that on safety grounds they wanted to limit the number of patients seen each day to 25. Let's talk to Dr Nada Khan, a GP registrar from Exeter. Hello to you. Why do you support the idea?
Thanks, Joe. And yes, absolutely. We need to have safe levels of what GPs are able to offer to their patients. We know that from work here in the UK and internationally, that having more than those 25 consultations a day isn't sustainable and can lead to unsafe practice. And this isn't so much about a normal GP's day of their 15-minute appointments and the regular admin tasks. But what's really at stake here is the kind of appointments that we call the duty doctor system. So the appointments that are called in on day, and they're really hard to predict. And that duty or on-call GP might have 70 or 80 appointments booked in a day, and that is not safe. GPs then only have a few minutes to speak to a patient, safely make a plan, and then document it. And that duty doctor system is the one that really needs to be capped at a safe limit. GPs are frankly worried they don't have the time to give patients the care that they need at a safe level.
What's it like for you if you have to see or end up seeing up to 70 or 80 patients a day?
So the main thing at risk here is time and burnout. So if you have that many patients on your list, you're not able to give them the time that they need or the care they need at a safe level. And that's just not a good place to be for patients. But also from the GP perspective, that's leading to more things like burnout and essentially is driving part of this real recruitment and retention crisis that we're facing in general practice as well.
Right.
With more GPs planning to leave patient care, especially even young GPs.
Right. I mean, is it practical, though, to have a limit of 25 patients a day?
So I think in the course of a normal GP's day, that is practical. So if you're breaking it down into a normal day of 15-minute appointments and home visits, so GPs would be essentially, seeing about 4 patients an hour at that level. And that's comparable to what hospital consultants are doing. So it's just really parity across the primary and secondary care interface.
Right. Stay with us, Dr. Khan. You were a practicing GP until 2019 when you became an MP. Do you share a sympathy with Dr. Khan? And you obviously understand what she's talking about. Would you support the idea of a cap?
Yeah, so I even raised it myself on the Health Select Committee as a way of looking at this. The difficulty, I think, of the 25 limit is if you're a duty doctor, you're doing phone calls, you're doing emails, you're seeing patients, you could have 80 contacts in a day. The danger of doing it like this is my worry is it's a little too prescriptive.
Right, so what sort of cap were you thinking of?
Well, the way I would solve the problem in my personal side is actually to limit list sizes. Now we've got a workforce plan. What you can actually do is correlate that to a list size. So when you join a GP, you sign up under a doctor, and that's their list. And so we know that the best kind of figures are down to about 1,800, but some doctors are dealing with 2,500. So what you could do is dovetail that down to allow to meet demand. Because the problem here, what Dr. Khan's getting at, is demand is just through the roof and the supply isn't there. So it's how you deal with that to make sure you don't feel like you've got the sword of Damocles above you on decisions you're making when it's people's health.
Preet, do you agree with Dr. Khan? A limit of 25 patients a day?
I think, look, just looking at this in isolation is really, really difficult. You've got to think about how do we release the pressure on GPs. The government has lost 2,000 GPs since 2015. We're not training enough. We've got a workforce plan. Of course, we can't wait for them to come in order to reduce the list. And that's why Labour is talking about how do we get a community offer. So there are really good examples like in Bromley by Bow. So it's not just the GP. Actually, it's the health visitor, the physiotherapist, the social prescribers that work together and deliver services so people can get a one-stop shop approach. We're also saying we'll offer 2 million more appointments to reduce the waiting list 7.7 million. And I think that is really, really important we do that.
Right, and I can see your holistic approach right across the NHS. But on this specific idea, would you back Dr. Khan's suggestion of 25 patients a day, a cap for all GPs?
Look, GPs are going above and beyond, and I appreciate there's a lot of pressure, and unless we have a mental health offer that releases a lot of pressure, you've got to understand what is the cases that GPs are dealing with in order to release that pressure, and therefore you've got to have a strategy to deal with that. Just to give an arbitrary number of 25 doesn't take into consideration, there are lots of, I'm just thinking about Birmingham, inner city, inequalities, real issues, lots of patients in one surgery, and, it's not spread out. So the ICB have really got to look at their regions and assess what the need is, look at the demographic and be clear as to what does it actually mean in terms of supporting GPs.
Listening to that, Dr. Khan, what do you make of Preet Gill saying it's an arbitrary target? And we heard from Luke, who was a GP like you, saying there are better ways of doing this.
Well, I think I take the point, but I think that there's a few things to unpick here. The first thing is that we really need to understand the scale of the problem. Hospitals have an alert system that's used that some of you might be familiar with those black and red alerts when demand is really high. And I think general practice first needs a similar system to show where the system is straining and when. And if we can identify where that's happening, then GPs can access extra support when capacity is not meeting the demand. And I think that having that system will allow practices to access and open up extra support, so suspending non-core work or freeing up local support packages. And that's all been outlined in the recent Royal College of GPs election manifesto as part of recommendations to go forward.
I mean, one of the worries I would have is that it may have an adverse effect on patients, a growing waiting list if you're not going through and getting through the lists of people wanting to see a GP.
I think that's exactly right. The question is it better to have a short appointment with a GP or no appointment with a GP? And with the waiting list where they're at, I think, I would err on the side of a shorter appointment. I think Dr. Conlon makes some really important points that for the sake of doctors and for patients, being rushed through, not getting that proper time and attention, not being able to do your job to the level that you feel you should be delivering, patients feeling the strain of that, it's not a great situation. And so much of this goes back 15 years to when the government and the British Medical Association decided to cap the number of training placements for doctors. We have started to reverse that. This is going to take a long time to feed through the system. In the meantime, we have to find more productivity gains. We absolutely can in the NHS. There's a lot of room for that. But we must be careful not to then say, well, it's very obvious the NHS could be more effective and productive. Thus, we're going to target individual doctors and make them double their appointments or caseloads. That's not reasonable either. So, I think Dr. Khan makes some important points about the stress that is falling on doctors when they just feel like they can't fully deliver for their patients.
Ava?
I'm not sure I agree with your no appointment or 10-minute window. I think, I think we've kind of got used to the sort of state of decay that Britain is in at the moment, and we're almost willing to accept the crumbs rather than accept, something or strive for something better. If you consider that more than half of misdiagnoses are made at the GP office, that's your first point of call. You've got more than half of people being misdiagnosed. You're now looking at a system that is not hoping to treat people or hope, to make them better or make their lives better. You're now just looking at an emergency system that's only dealing with people who've got a broken leg and can deal with that,
Ava,
that quickly.
I could not agree with you more. I think we need a fundamental rethink of the way that the entire system is structured, and I don't think it's good enough for patients. But in terms of what we're dealing with today, tomorrow, if you're a patient calling up and you can get 10 minutes or you have no appointment because there's a cap of 25, it's in that very narrow mindset that I'm thinking about this.
But I disagree with that, because the problem you've got at the moment is that you've got doctors now sitting on the front line who are telling you that they are burnt out, that they can't cope. You've got 1 in 3 under 30s quitting in their first year of being a GP. I mean, that's an astonishing figure. Why are so many of them quitting?
But how do you fix this tomorrow so there are more appointments, more time to be seen? I mean, truly tomorrow, how would you make it so that you could have that 20-minute appointment and doctors would only be seeing 15 people?
Well, I would argue that keeping more doctors in there would free up more appointments. So if people are quitting, you're not going to have any appointments at all, are you?
Let me just come to it, because you're a Shadow Health Minister. Keir Starmer has said he wants reform. Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, has said he wants reform. What does that look like?
So it's what I talked about. It's about what's the community offer. So, for example, we know people have to go to outpatient appointments in hospitals. Why can't that be put in the community? What is the role of pharmacists, for example? Lots of them do independent prescribing. The government's delayed its plan and initiative. They want to do more. They can do more. That will release pressure from GPs, having mental health hubs. And, of course, we've talked about our Fit for Future Fund. This is about doubling the MRI scanners, the CT scanners, reducing the waiting list. Reform is about, it isn't just about where you put money, it's how you target the support
absolutely.
in terms of making sure that you're delivering a service where we are picking up and predicting illnesses. So MRI and CT scanners will have AI diagnostics.
They are all good ideas. But let's say you win the election next year. Will the NHS, a couple of years after that, look radically different to the way it does now?
Absolutely.
Really?
In our first term, we are committed to reducing the waiting list down. We are absolutely committed. Well, it's 2 million appointments every single year, and that's obviously making sure that the staff can work weekends and evenings.
Do you think that's
but the other thing is, Joe, I want to say, look, procurement is a big issue, right? Lots of people in the NHS say that innovators can't get into the NHS in terms of the technology that they have. Technology, we've got to get the NHS into the digital age. It is so important because,
I've heard this many, many times before, showing my age. Is that going to be the silver bullet in terms of transforming the NHS?
It's not going to be the silver bullet, although I agree with you that technology is a big part of this answer. Am I hopeful that Labour could, have some meaningful impact on the NHS? Yes. I think Wes Streeting, Labour's Shadow Health Secretary, speaks more honestly about the state of the NHS and how poorly it performs for patients than almost any other politician. But I think there's something more fundamental we have to grapple with here, and it speaks to the point you were starting to make there about retaining doctors. this is not an issue of having too few doctors only, okay? I think we need more staff in the NHS. But if we compare 2019 levels to these post-pandemic 2023 levels, we have 18% more clinical staff, 19% more nurses, 25% more junior doctors. I want to retain the ones that are leaving, but we have significantly more staff, not fewer. And yet fewer people are being seen, fewer emergency and non-emergency appointment admissions are taking place.
Well, hang on, let me ask you this. Well, the Tories have been in power for 13 years. I mean, Luke, perhaps you can answer that question. The Times headline, NHS failing to improve despite rise in budget and staff. The NHS employing, as Kate has said, 16% more doctors than it did 4 years ago and 37% more than in 2010. And Conservative ministers always like to tell me that they've got record amounts going into the NHS, but it's still failing. Those waiting lists aren't coming down and productivity is unbelievably low. Why?
You're absolutely right. And if there's a quick answer to this, then we'd have it and have solved it.
Well, no, you've had 30 years, so it hasn't been quick, that's for sure.
You cut me off on that as well. You're absolutely right. So some of the changes that we brought in with the NHS white paper to bring in the ICBs is a way of allowing the doctors and the specialists to solve the problem themselves. But we're a year into that, and we're starting to see fruition about breaking down some of those barriers, because they are the ones who are going to solve the problem. As a GP, 15% of my workload was dealt with chasing paperwork. I don't know if Dr. Khan's still there.
She is.
I don't know how much time you spend chasing paperwork, letters, patients coming in saying, you know, I've been prescribed a new drug, doctor, can you prescribe it for me? And you don't have the letter. This kind of inefficiency, that productivity is staggeringly bad. My wife's a GP in the NHS, and when she refers patients, she's on a border, she can't access the blood test from one hospital to another. These are really simple changes that can be made, which the ICBs are looking at. There's £150 million going in to sort this out, but it's not quick enough, because that, if you release the staff, making the working life better for the staff, patients will have better outcomes and this productivity gap will close.
Why do you think, Dr. Khan, that productivity is so low in the NHS?
So I think it's difficult to say that productivity is going low from a GP's perspective. I mean, GPs are dealing with hugely increasing pressures. We know that GPs are carrying out almost 20% more appointments now than they were in 2019. And as Mr. Evans has described, there's an increase in those admin tasks by about 28% in the same period. So GPs are dealing with more complex patients, this rising demand, and a much older population, which means we just need more time to safely manage their needs.
Right. I mean, what do you say, Ava, to the productivity conundrum? More money, more staff, and yet those figures barely move.
I'm really uncomfortable with the word productivity. I always find it very uncomfortable when we use that.
Seeing more patients, having the waiting list come down.
Sure, but whenever we use that on, with humans, I think, you're kind of treating them like technology or like a piece of machinery. Not you, but this was a word that was used on the other side of the table, with all due respect. But I mean, I don't actually think that Dr. Luke there answered the question about why for 13 years, you have been in charge and you have been looking at this. OK, there's an NHS white paper. What help is that to someone right now who's trying to get a GP appointment?
And you're right, so let's look at the 4 different nations in the UK that are run by 4 different parties, are all struggling with the problem. As we heard from the doctor, you've got an ageing population with more difficult, complex needs. You've got more of a splintered professional workforce to help support supplementary. The problem is that means GPs are repeatedly, one after the other, dealing with more and more complex patients. And that's really tough, because we've got an ageing population. And you've got to remember how quickly technology moves.
Luke,
for sorting
this is
that.
also about the 1.6 billion delayed discharge. There are 13,000 people in hospital who do not need to be there. They could fill 26 hospitals. We're spending more money on recruitment and agency workers, about £3 billion of the budget. So we really have got to look at the social care workforce strategy,
party,
because that is having a huge
Wales's
impact.
Figures, the S&P figures. I mean, we don't like to do this.
But you have had 13 years. Unfortunately, you have failed. It is the number one important issue alongside economy for the British public. They're really worried.
Polls have written an article that says across the world, GPs, there's a shortage, a dearth of them. It's a really difficult place for any developed nation to try and deal with an ageing population. You only have to look on what's going on in Japan to deal with it. Everyone is struggling with the right answer, but simple things, I would argue, like improving the technology for the staff, like putting extra protection in on list sizes, would make a huge difference to the work quality and therefore patient outcome and better continuity.
This is Labour's plan, Luke.
But it's happening at the moment.
That's exactly what you were saying. It is not.
I'm
It's happening at the moment.
sorry to side with this part of the table as well, but I think we have to talk about productivity. I don't think that's a dirty word. I think whether you think the NHS is the best healthcare creation ever, or if, like me, you look look at the outcomes for patients and you think it's not so great. It is not controversial to suggest that we would like to have a public sector system that is able to do more with the same amount of money, especially now that it has record level highs of more resources. And if you're going to be pumping that kind of money into the NHS, simply for it to stay afloat and to have fewer people in hospitals being seen in emergency and non-emergency admissions compared to pre-pandemic, with more money, with more staff, we have to be able to say something's going wrong there. And you know, that is the human way of saying productivity.
But you're apportioning the blame there to the GPs who are tackling, you know, a huge tide of patients.
I'm not suggesting that the GPs are at fault at all. I think it's the system that fails doctors and patients.
And that would require a huge digital translation that we haven't even spoken about yet. We haven't even talked about.
And unfortunately, we haven't got time to do that today. But Dr. Nada Khan, thank you very much for joining us for that discussion. Let's talk about Brexit and about Nissan, because were some of the warnings about the economic impact of Brexit just too gloomy? Let's have a look at this Daily Mail headline. Nissan makes U-turn over Brexit, the headline says, as bosses admit they were too gloomy about leaving the EU and insist the UK will be its European base for the foreseeable future. Nissan is investing £2 billion in a plan to build 3 electric car models in Sunderland. The Japanese company said there'd been a negligible effect from leaving the European Union. Now, that is a change from their position at the time of the referendum, which had issued warnings about the impact of Brexit, even suggesting they may have to pull out of the UK. You heard in the headlines, but let's play you a little bit more of the warnings about the threats to the car industry, because it was a key plank of so-called Project Fear in the referendum. Let's have a listen to David Cameron from the Remain campaign.
Think of the impact on the car workers at Cowley in Oxford who make the cars right behind me. Think of the wider impact: fewer businesses, fewer jobs, a smaller economy, and less money for our schools and hospitals. Add those things together: the shock impact, the uncertainty impact, the trade impact, and you put a bomb under our economy. And the worst thing is, we would have lit the fuse ourselves.
Well, explosive rhetoric there from the former Prime Minister David Cameron, now, of course, the Foreign Secretary. Luke, was he too gloomy, and was the party too gloomy about it?
Oh, gosh, 7 years on.
I know, a trip down memory lane.
Absolutely, we're still having this debate here. Look, I'm pleased to see that Nissan have changed their position as the facts have changed. I think that's very healthy. When he was asked, you know, he said he was surprised to see why people are asking why the UK, because we've got the skills and we're a great place. One thing businesses want is certainty. We're 7 years on, we're getting that now. We're starting to see the fruition of, you know, £2 billion worth of investment there, £29.5 billion yesterday into the UK at the summit. I mean, this is a good start. There's a long way to go, don't get me wrong, but this is important that they've come out and said that we see a stable base, and it serves a signal across the world that Britain's open for business, come and invest, and that's what we're seeing.
Do you think the Foreign Secretary understands that now?
Yes, having heard him speak, I think he was very good when he came to the 1922 committee, without giving too much away.
Talking to Conservative MPs.
Talking to Conservative MPs. He was challenged on that, and I think he's come and he's been out in public and said, look, he is fully committed to where we're going, doesn't want to look backwards, wants to look forward. And I think, actually, regardless, this isn't a party political thing. I think everyone needs to get on with it. That was a decision made by the public. Let's crack on, and this is the kind of thing that we want to see more of. I think we can all agree on that.
You voted to leave the EU?
I did.
Right, so you didn't agree with David Cameron then, obviously. I mean, you campaigned to remain, like most of the Labour Party. Was Project Fear overblown?
Look, Labour's looking forward and not backward.
Looking forward, yeah.
Look, we are, under Keir Starmer, we are a changed Labour Party and we are looking forward. Manufacturing is really important to our communities. I come from the West Midlands. The automotive industry, hugely important. I'm really pleased that Nissan sees that expertise and is obviously investing in those good quality jobs. There's huge amount in supply chains, for example. Labour has an automotive strategy. We know, though, that Nissan has been saying there are two things that they want support from the government: electrification, business hasn't had certainty, and, of course, on energy bills, support around, you know, supporting their business model.
But were they right? We saw Harriet Harman there too, senior Labour politician. Was she right to warn about the downsides of Brexit to the economy?
It's not perfect. We still don't have a veteran agreement. There's still lots of bureaucracy. I speak to businesses all the time. They are saying it's very difficult to get products into the country. We're having to put that money onto consumers because we're having to pay more. We could simplify it. There's a lot more to do, and Labour is absolutely committed to work with business to address that.
It's another thing to suggest Brexit's been good for the economy, though, isn't it, Kate? Because actually, overall, according to the Office for Budget Responsibility, hasn't UK trade and GDP been damaged?
GDP is a little more controversial, actually, in the sense that it was only in September that the Office for National Statistics significantly revised upwards the UK's estimated economic growth.
But I think the OBR is still sticking to that 4% smaller for the UK economy as a forecast, admittedly, than we would have been if we'd stayed in the EU.
I think those forecasts are brought into question when you have significant revisions like 2%. We thought this summer that the economy was still below its pre-pandemic levels. We now know it recovered. In December 2021, the UK was not an outlier in advanced economies. It was actually quite average, and I think that has been a real hit to the Brexit argument. To your point, Joe, Brexit and whether or not it's going to be a success has always been and always will be a choice. This is no guarantee that it's going to be successful, but there are choices that the Labour Party is making to decide that they're actually going to make a good go of it. And I think this Nissan story is just more proof of that.
Were people like David Cameron too gloomy at the time?
Well, I think it was perfectly reasonable to point out the downsides of Brexit. There are trade-offs to any decision. I think they were also
they didn't
too
just point
gloomy.
out the downsides. They said it would be disastrous.
Sure. And look, it is absolutely remarkable that you have politicians standing outside car manufacturing companies that are now getting £2 billion worth of private, mostly private, I should say, investment. I think in many cases they were too gloomy. But I suppose what I'm trying to get at here is this idea that Brexit is perfect or Brexit is a disaster always has been, and I think always will be wrong. It's a choice on the part of politicians and on companies who respond to politicians as to what they're going to do with it.
I mean, just because Nissan says now the downsides are negligible of Brexit as they see it, were those politicians wrong or were they right about the hit to the economy?
Well, those downsides are somewhat negligible for them because they've also had help from the government and they have been incentivised to stay in the country. And, you know, perhaps this isn't even a conversation about Brexit. Perhaps this is a conversation about whether the state should be more interventionist and maybe the state should be, you know, more entrepreneurial. You know, if you look at that area, Nissan, for every one job that Nissan provides, you've got 4 supplementary jobs. If you look at, you know, what that could do around the country, perhaps it's a conversation for governments. Maybe we need more intervention, more cash being pumped into private companies.
Right. I mean, the new trading relationship. This is the Kate?
Well, no, look, they are taking, I think, £200 million from government in total of this $2 billion, and I wish they weren't. I think that this deal shows that private companies can put up the money, and that is really where it should be coming from.
I mean, putting a bomb under the economy, though, and then we're lighting the fuse, was that too hyperbolic in terms of describing what Brexit could do?
Oh, it depends what... I mean, you just there said that, you know, we are quite average. Our growth has been average.
In advanced economies.
But it depends if you want to strive for average. I mean, should that be the benchmark? We should be going for we're doing OK.
And their growth forecasts have been revised down. We heard Andrew Bailey, the Bank of England governor, saying that they're the worst he's seen in his lifetime.
Genuinely remarkable comments at a time when the Prime Minister is trying to get more business investment. Really, really special stuff. Look, if I were a politician right now, a Tory politician, I would not want to stand up and praise the UK's growth figures. This pledge that Rishi Sunak has to have the economy growing by the end of the year, you know, 0.5, 0.6% is nothing I would boast about. The UK has a serious growth problem as well as a productivity problem. But the question about whether or not Brexit is responsible for all of that, when you've had a pandemic, when you've had Russia's illegal war against Ukraine, it's mixed. And as I said, the revisions from not what we think is going to happen in the future, what's actually happened are much more positive than a lot of people would like to admit.
Ava?
I mean, if you're one of the businesses who, you know, in and around the country over the last 10 years who have gone bust or haven't been able to trade with Europe anymore, I think you think very differently, wouldn't you?
Of course you would, and so much more needs to be done, particularly for those smaller businesses, and I think the Windsor Framework was a step in the right direction.
And Labour's National Wealth Fund is exactly that. For every £1 we put in, that will be £3 from the private sector, creating those gigafactories, really investing in jobs across the country, the technical skills colleges, matching skills, working with businesses, much more aligned. That's what businesses want, more certainty, a government that understands that they'll have to be a little bit interventionist and not just leave them to it, but they want that certainty in terms of what that level of investment looks like in the longer term.
And ambition as well. I mean, if you look at Europe, you've got plans for 50 gigafactories. I mean, you know, they're way ahead of us. We've got, what, half of a factory? You know, if you want to start playing on the world stage again, then you've got to think with ambition.
Well, talking of the world stage, let's have a look at this headline in the Times. Green retreat dented Britain's reputation, warns COP26 chief. Let me just unravel some of that. That was Alok Sharma. He was the head of the climate summit before. It's now being held in Dubai from this Thursday. Rishi Sunak, the King, and the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, are going to attend the summit. But Alok Sharma has said Britain has lost its international reputation on climate change and left other countries thinking it has walked away from the issue. And that is the government's own former head of COP. What do you say?
I respect Alok a lot. I've worked in the last year in the energy department, so as the
But is he
PPS,
right?
I sat on the bed. No, I don't think he is actually, because under where Alok was when we went into that COP, only 30% of the world had signed up to this legal framework. We're up to 90%. We, as the global developed country, have had the biggest decarbonisation on the planet, bar none. So we are leading at this and dropped by 48%.
Well,
No, but it's really important. So when we go up there, there is still a long way for the world to go, but we need to bring them with us on that basis. But you've got to bring the people with us too. So you see the likes of ULEZ and the eruption around that. The danger is you force people into decisions, and that's the difficulty on the back of a cost of living crisis and the difficulty there. We've got to try and bring people with us, and that's achievable, and that's where we want to get to as a
Because
problem.
you didn't actually bring people with you in the previous policies that you had in place to combat climate change.
No, they have come with us on, changing their vehicles, getting solar panels up. We've cut VAT on that, for example. Air source heat pumps are going to encourage people to make those decisions. Smart meters, everyone can get a smart meter. These are all decisions that people can make that all collectively add up. Personal responsibility, council's responsibility, government responsibility, and then global responsibility, because it can be a very scary place as an individual to say, what can you do?
I think
there's a plethora of measures that can help.
I think Alok Sharma is absolutely right. I mean, let's not forget, Rishi had to be dragged to COP27. He said he wasn't going to go. He didn't get it. I mean, we are heading to a catastrophe in terms of global warming to 2.5 degrees, and we have got to do much more. And he's right. Under the Conservatives over 13 years, but certainly in the last couple of years, this government has destroyed our reputation on the world stage. It matters what you do domestically. Let's not forget the ban on onshore wind. U-turned, had to support Labour. He's finally come around.
So how much are you going to borrow to do it?
He's finally come around. We're not going to... We will borrow to invest, but not borrow for day-to-day spending.
Which is inflationary.
No. But in the second part of our parliament, we have said, of course, the Green Prosperity Plan, which is about having energy security. Yeah. This is about jobs.
Is it going to happen, Preet? Because although Keir Starmer is going, you're absolutely right, to the summit, it's been reported over the last week or so that actually this £28 billion a year being spent on climate policies, well, it's being delayed, that we know, but it might not happen at all, we hear.
No, that is absolutely not true. So let me just be absolutely clear. In the second term of our parliament, we will absolutely commit to going...
Second term?
Of course, if we are privileged enough to be
so it's not
elected...
so you're not going to borrow that money for investment in the first term?
If we are privileged enough, we will absolutely look at the fiscal situation we inherit, and we will work towards a plan as to how we can reach that target, working with business...
When?
Well, look, I mean, the things that we want to deliver around GB energy, retrofitting homes, all of the solar power energy, that will take time. You've got to look at the fiscal situation and set a plan, don't you, at the first... You can't do that now when we don't...
This was a centrepiece. This has been a centrepiece of Labour's offer leading up to a general election. Yep. It now sounds like it might not happen at all. So we were told Labour are committed to spending and investing up to £28 billion a year. When?
Look, the fiscal situation at the moment, as we're very clear from our Shadow Chancellor, is that the 28 billion is likely to be hit at a second term of a Labour government. Of course, we've got to be privileged, and
so
that's because
after 2029.
No, but no. Actually, it won't be. But it will. It
was by the end of the first Parliament, is
at
what
the end of the first Parliament.
Well, does that disappoint you, Ava?
It shocks me because of the conversation we've just had before this, which is about building, which is about this ambitious target we're going to have. Everything that you want in your climate... Hang on, everything you want in your climate policy would match with what you're building. So you're now telling us that if you're not going to meet those targets, you're not going to borrow that money until your second term.
Ava, how will you get those supply chains set up?
You're not actually going to be building anything in the first place.
No, that's not true. Those supply chains will take about 2 years to create, and it's about working with industry. No one is going to expect us to be spending 28 billion in the first year.
No, they are.
No, they are not. Absolutely not.
Well, hang on. It was the end of... It would be in the first term by the end of that
first
term. But
so this is about working with business to create those supply chains, chains so that we can hit that target. Nobody's expecting us to deliver that on year 1 and year 2.
Is the caution right?
We are working towards it.
I think both the Tories and Labour have realised, have got a bit of a dose of reality there, especially when it comes to public spending and what the public will tolerate.
All right, that's all we have time for. Thank you very much for keeping us all company. We'll have Prime Minister's questions here tomorrow on Politics Live at 11:15. Please join me and my guest then. Bye-bye.
this is where we begin.
This game belongs